Okay, well, welcome everybody. Um, just liking to let you know that this is being captioned, so that and that's you can find out about that in the chat. We'll tell you about that. So, uh, first of all, an acknowledgement to country. I'd like to acknowledge that we gather here today on the land of the Wurundjeri people, in my case, and acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. So my name's Helen Stokes, and I'm the co-leader of the Melbourne Social Equity Institute's research program on mental health and society. And I also work at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, doing research work around trauma-informed work in schools. So the mental health and society theme is one of our new themes at the Institute. But it's also one that's getting an increasing amount of interest in it. And we're hoping to have regular seminars in that area over the coming year. And so please subscribe to the email list if you haven't already. So just some housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and it'll be shared on the MSEI website after the event. We're using the Q&A function, so please post any questions you have for our speaker in that box. The chat function is also on, so if you wish to say hello to people, you can, or chat among yourselves, you can certainly do that as well. So now I'd like to come to the important part of the proceedings. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Piers. Dr. Piers Gooding is a research fellow at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute and the University of Melbourne's Law School. He's also an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellow and a 2020 Mozilla Foundation Fellow. And his work focuses on the law and politics of disability, with an increasing focus on digital technology in mental health care. So I'd like to hand over to Piers now, who will share his screen. Thank you.
Hi everybody. I'd like to also begin by acknowledging that the Melbourne Social Equity Institute stands on the unceded land of the Kulin Nations and the Wurundjeri people, and pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are present. Thanks also to Claire at the Institute for assisting behind the scenes, and for Helen for making time in what is probably a very busy period for everyone here. So I'd like to begin my presentation in 1973 at an international computer science conference where two early chatbots, or chatterbots as they were originally called, were placed in conversation with each other. The first bot was ELIZA, which was a program built in 1964 by Professor Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT's Artificial Intelligence Lab, and was programmed to replicate the conversational style of a psychoanalyst. The second bot, Parry, made a few years later by a Stanford psychiatrist, was designed to mimic an adult man with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So this conversation was organised by Vint Cerf, who is generally considered to be an internet pioneer and now holds a senior position at Google. And in fact, last week he was just criticising the Australian government for its new media content laws that impact Google. Now, the script between ELIZA and Parry, these two programs, is bizarre. It sort of fails as a replication of human conversation, and it's mostly ridiculous. But this strange story is very much a milestone of computer programming history. But it's also, and this is a point I want to make in this presentation, an indication that the history of AI, and indeed the rise of big tech, has very much been shaped by psychological and psychiatric knowledge. Now, there are many indicators of how this knowledge continues to be expressed, but two prominent examples are the way psychological knowledge has been harnessed in persuasive or addictive design, depending on how you frame it, to keep us glued to our screen, but also in the way that each major tech firm now employs chief medical officers and a large staff of physicians and clinicians. And these developments, particularly in the last 10 years, especially with the accessibility of many of the technologies I'll be discussing, have fueled what I would describe as a radical expansion of algorithmic and data-driven technology in the mental health context and in various mental health contexts. But there's also a continuation in many ways of particular styles of thinking that are common to psychology and psychiatry in recent years, which have long been interested in making the inner world and our inner lives calculable and knowable through sort of numbers and so on. So these traditions are now being expanded upon through computer science. And I'm using the term algorithmic and data-driven technology to describe a range of digital technologies in personalised and or group mental health initiatives, typically technologies that analyse big amounts of data algorithmically. And that's quite a broad definition and goes beyond humanoid robotic counsellors, as you may have expected the presentation to be, to include technologies designed for information sharing, communication, clinical decision support, digital therapies, so-called, patient and or population monitoring and control, service user health informatics, and so on. If you are interested in chatbot counsellors, I'd encourage you to follow the work of Dr. Kobe Leans here at the university, who led a really great team to write a piece that should be released in a month or two with the great title, To Chat or Bot to Chat. And I'll not go into detail into these different categories of technology, which I've mapped in a paper that you can find on my open access website for materials that I've written. But I want to try and paint a picture of the broad changes that are afoot concerning mental health in the information age, and then draw out some questions that I think are relevant to the Social Equity Institute's research themes of digital equity, mental health and society. So there are clear examples of what appear to be fairly uncontroversial and successful uses of digital technology in the mental health context. These include computer-based supported decision-making that helps people who are accessing mental health services to communicate their preferences in ways that make sense to them. And this is an example from the US of decision support software that's used in services, and it was software developed by a prominent service user advocate, Patricia Deegan. There are also various forms of online peer networking, tele or virtual counselling and crisis support. Here's an example from a prominent organisation representing people who've used services or who have psychosocial disability in Kenya. And they have a really interesting peer support networking platform that provides for mutual aid to assist people. There are also forms of digitised auditing and monitoring of mental health services to improve services and prevent harms against service recipients. So, for example, information processing of prescription data to detect dangerous or problematic prescribing levels in aged care settings of various kind of medications, including in the mental health context. So these are, as I said, uncontroversial, but there are also examples of harms caused by digital technologies. Criminal justice agencies, for example, have been found in Canada to have breached privacy laws by sharing what is non-criminal information about the mental health of citizens, which was then used in discriminatory ways. Toronto police gathered data about people who had experienced self-injury in which police were involved or attempts of suicide. And that data was shared with a national database that was then shared with US Homeland Security, who in turn shared the material with border authorities, who turned people away based on those experiences and those records. There are examples of mainstream mental health websites that are not complying with data protection regulations and are transmitting personally identifiable data about people into what is, as we probably all are aware now, a vast and lucrative trade in human tracking. And this organisation here, Privacy International, analysed over 100 popular web pages in Germany, France and the UK related to depression, and found that around 98% contained a third-party element that enabled targeted advertising by large companies such as Google, Facebook and Amazon. This included NHS service websites in the UK. And I'll flag Amazon 3 times. That was the first. And most of these websites failed to meet the EU General Data Protection Regulation, which is often seen as a kind of leading example of data protection law. 2 recent studies also found that of the very popular mental health apps, and there are reportedly over 10,000 mental health related apps, but of the most popular apps, just under half of those that were surveyed had a privacy policy that informed users about how their data, their personal information would be collected and shared with third parties. There are also examples of the hacking or leaking of confidential records of recipients of mental health services. This is an example just from a few weeks ago in which there was large-scale hacking of tens of thousands of people's psychotherapy records in Finland, which resulted in data trafficking and then extortion attempts against victims under the threat of people releasing that information publicly. But then also on a smaller scale around the world, there are examples of inadvertent breaches of confidentiality. For example, this school in Melbourne that inadvertently leaked confidential health and disability status information of students. Other examples and practices are more ambiguous, at least in the sense of dividing public opinion or sparking debates about the benefits and harms of particular technologies. So examples include AI-based suicide prevention, and these are used by social media companies as well as government agencies to attempt to identify people using large amounts of data who seem to be at high or immediate risk of self-harm and to direct first responders to them. There are issues here, of course, with a lack of independent auditing of this process when it comes to social media companies doing it. Research into the benefits and potential harms can't exist outside of that company. And then there's issues of consent of users and those services who may not realise police could be sent to a person's location. And then questions, particularly in the US, around the risk of police being the first people to encounter someone who's in a state of crisis. Particularly given the high rates of disability among those who are shot by police. And another example that is currently under discussion is the use of behavioural sensing or digital phenotyping, as it's described by this author here, via devices like mobile phones to predict psychiatric diagnostic categories or monitor for crisis and support needs. So this could include computational analysis of data produced by touchscreen typing patterns on device, the way a person uses their device, keyboard tapping, voice modulation, mobility, contact with people, and so on. This app, Mindstrong, is one of the prominent sort of behavioural sensing apps, and you can see the way it's presented here in this article of an app that can tell you're depressed before you know it yourself, which is quite a revealing kind of message. But this is also an app that received foundation funding from Jeff Bezos's venture capital firm. And we can start to see this type of practice creeping from experimental research in psychology and psychiatry journals into more mainstream arenas. Here you can see a report on Airbnb patenting software that purports to use algorithmic technology to scrape people's social media accounts to determine whether a customer displays narcissism or psychopathy. Another example is electronic monitoring of forensic patients, where you see quite a diverse range of responses in policy and law. I find these images quite striking. On the left, you can see an image of the famous Bethlehem Hospital, or Bedlam, as it was historically known, which is synonymous with madness and psychiatry and the popular imagination. And on the right, you can see geospatial mapping, or geofencing, as it's noted here, for people who may be under forensic mental health orders, by which people are subject to a monitoring device being placed on their body, usually on an ankle, and that being used in the monitoring of those individuals who may leave the service for a period. And interestingly, you find diverse responses around the world in England and Wales, it's only possible where a person voluntarily enters into wearing one of these devices and subjecting themselves to monitoring. In Australia, it's allowed in 2 jurisdictions that I'm aware of coercively against the wishes of the person, and that occurred in Queensland first, which interestingly occurred against the submissions of clinical professionals. And in jurisdictions like Nova Scotia in Canada, GPS monitoring of forensic patients is prohibited. It's prohibited on grounds of human rights and claims that such a move is counter-therapeutic. So you might say that this is evidence of the securitized and politicized use of some forms of monitoring technologies. So these are just a handful of an expanding array of examples. Again, my article on mapping digital mental health technologies gives a fuller account of the range of technology out there. Governments have very much embraced digital technologies in mental health services as a cost-effective, accessible alternative or supplement to face-to-face support. And anyone with a passing interest in, say, the Royal Commission into Mental Health could see why, with hard to access communities and the kind of cost effectiveness of reaching people online. I'll generally confine my discussion here to Australia, which I'm told by some sort of leading clinical figures in the field is one of the most advanced countries when it comes to investment in infrastructure and research and practice of digital forms of mental health technology. But in Australia, there's a new digital mental health framework being developed to advise government on where investment should occur. The National Safety and Quality Digital Mental Health Standards were just released this week by the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. I'd commend those to anyone interested. There's the Australian Digital Health Agency, multiple centres of research, the newly formed Australian Institute of Digital Health. There is the Digital Health Cooperative Research Centre, which is dedicated to commercialising initiatives receiving based on government and industry research. So a considerable amount of funding has gone into digitising mental health services or virtualising services, which appears to have very much amplified under the pandemic condition, which probably isn't a surprise to many of you. In March 2020, for example, there was an additional $74 million in funding announced for the Head to Health website, which is a centralised resource for mental health services around the country. And $3 million was announced more recently by the Morrison government for artificial intelligence health projects concerning youth mental health. There are other examples, but to give you a sense of the acceleration of these measures, or at least some kind of digital therapies, online counselling, the Federal Minister for Health reported that after the addition of telehealth under the Medicare benefits scheme, and this kind of expansion of the inclusion of mental health in telehealth has happened around the country, around the world rather, with the need for social distancing. But over 10 million services were delivered to over 5 million patients, and that was just in early May. And a significant proportion of these were mental health related. And the Minister described this as changes that would have otherwise taken 10 years being done in 10 days, speaking specifically about the involvement of mental health in this area. And similarly, Dr. Ruth Vine, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Australia for Mental Health, estimated that approximately 50% of the clinical mental health sector had transitioned to using telehealth. So these comments suggest that mental health services and organisations are likely to have developed governance structures for this major shift in a matter of weeks or months, whereas governance planning under typical conditions would have taken several years. And of course, as my presentation so far has, I hope, given you a sense, it's not just government or clinical enthusiasm driving this shift, or professional enthusiasm. There's also a vast sum of tech capital in particular being invested into various health technologies. Market forecasts could perhaps be taken with a grain of salt, but according to at least one forecast published in the Financial Times, the digital health market is expected to be worth nearly $640 billion by 2026, at which time, mind you, they are estimating that 5 billion people will have access to a smartphone. And a major proportion of that market concerns mental health. And certainly it looks like that when you look through the pages of news like Financial Times. So, for example, the largest condition-specific area in the health app market, which is, again, forecast to be worth many billions of dollars, $230 billion by one estimate by 2026, mental health is the largest condition-specific group in that area. And for my final reference to Amazon, it's interesting that just 2 weeks ago, Amazon has launched an online pharmacy service. So you can see different examples of particularly big tech companies moving into spaces. Here's an example of Microsoft moving into that space. So you can see here an expanding array of digital technologies in the mental health context, and what is an expanding field of knowledge, of technical capability, of public interest, government interest, and you might even say a sort of negotiation of power that's playing out in an interesting interplay between people with first-hand experience of using services or seeking support, academic researchers in clinical fields and other disciplines in collaboration with computer scientists, as well as various parts of the market and, of course, the government. I'd like to just make a point about data sensitivity in the mental health context compared to general health. I've made the argument that personal mental health information is uniquely sensitive under current medico-legal frameworks, and I suppose general health information is considered to be among the more sensitive or the most highly sensitive of personal information. But mental health, like general health data, can open doors to essential health and social services like crisis services, early intervention and welfare services and so on. But unlike general health, or at least in most forms of general health, personal mental health information can influence criminal justice proceedings in attributing culpability, mitigating sentencing, factoring into risk assessment. And this could include addiction materials. It can attract discrimination, for example, financial and employment discrimination, insurance discrimination is a big issue, and can be used in state-authorised forms of coercion in the form of hospital detention and forced treatment. So in this sense, I think personal mental health data qualitatively differs from general health data, and there's in some instances greater difficulty and uncertainty in applying legal standards. So public trust becomes absolutely crucial. So what do I see as the interesting questions for future work? Well, I think it's really interesting and fun even to think about the ideal forms of governance in tech development, and particularly for those who are most affected. How can public knowledge inform technological development beyond an expert-centric or technocratic approach? There seems to be broad agreement that people with first-hand experience of services should be very much at the front of developing, designing, but also implementing and having oversight over technologies. And that was very much captured in the Quality Digital Mental Health Standards, in fact, as one of three major sort of principles guiding the framework. One interesting possibility is how this might go even further or might include some fundamental questions about whether algorithmic technologies in some instances should be used at all for certain tasks. And if so, who gets to govern them? There are also interesting questions to ask, I think, about the role of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is widely considered to be one of the more important legal and political developments concerning mental health in the 21st century. And had a really high level of input of people with lived experience of services and disability and health and mental health and so on. So where might a human rights approach assist in developing public governance, and where might it be limited, I think, are questions that deserve being asked. And another interesting point to explore in some legal scholarship on science and technology is whether one of the keys to creating good technology, and therefore good sort of laws and policies and public responses, is trying to de-enchant AI and other technologies of automation. So what might be needed to de-enchant thinking so that people aren't assuming that these technologies are capable of superhuman thinking around particular issues. Because in doing so, I think it would allow not only those developing technology, but also lawyers and regulators, policymakers and the broader public to be clear-eyed about the promise and the challenges of these developments. Interestingly, Joseph Weizenbaum, the maker of the program ELIZA, said that what I hadn't realised is that the extremely short exposures to a relatively simple computer program could induce powerful delusional thinking in quite normal people. I mean, there's lots to unpack there from a perspective of an interest in mental health and society and equity around, you know, how delusion should be seen, what normal people are, but it raises a really interesting question around how people can be enchanted by computer programs and computer programming, and particularly I think that occurs with AI, machine learning and so on. But also the history of both mental health sciences as well as big tech are littered with hubris and outlandish claims about new developments that will solve long-standing and highly complex social issues. So for psychiatry and neuroscience, you periodically hear about sort of breakthroughs that might solve mental illness or at least revolutionise care. Anyone with a passing interest in developments over the last 30 years will have heard that several times. For technologists, it might be solving issues using AI from crime, corruption, pollution, and so on. And these two trends in thinking perhaps peaked when Elon Musk said that his new brain chips would be able to solve schizophrenia. So I think one way to potentially sort of draw things down to earth and have a more modest focus, and perhaps a way to avoid persistent reductionist habits, is for formal and life sciences to continue an ongoing or develop an ongoing dialogue with the social sciences and the humanities. I mean, that's certainly an interest at the Institute, which is an interdisciplinary institute looking at some of these complex social issues. I'm very interested in what contribution can be made with resources from sociology, anthropology, philosophy, geography, and so on, and which alongside with legal changes can help sort of look at some of the core drivers for distress, but also create some of the social conditions that maximise human wellbeing. So, look, I think they'll be particularly relevant too for some of those theoretical questions around claims about what algorithmic and data-driven technology can tell us about people's inner life. So the idea that we have digital biomarkers in how we use devices that can detect silent signs of an underlying disorder, I think these kind of things ought to be subject to great scrutiny. And speaking of Elon Musk, who's now the second richest person to Jeff Bezos, the digitisation of services can potentially accelerate the positioning of distressed or potentially distressed people as a consumer. So the research literature often describes and evaluates mental health technologies as if they were products. And one expression of this is the tendency to describe what would have previously been a counselling or clinical encounter to be presented as lessons. So what are the implications of viewing these initiatives as products? You know, how privacy applies when it comes to making consumers, in the traditional sense of consuming products, out of service users or patients is an open question. And it draws out the fuzzy intersection, or it draws the issue rather to the intersection of healthcare and consumer protection in the age of big tech. So if there's one argument to take away, that seems quite trite to say, but we don't need brain chips or better algorithms to solve the challenges of mental health in the digital age. We do need responsible public governance of those technologies as one component in the overall system. But what that looks like remains a pressing and open question. So I'd be really interested in feedback. And thank you very much again for coming to listen to this presentation. Helen, I assume you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much.
The yawning, awkward gap when someone finishes a presentation on a webinar and can't hear applause.
Yeah, I know, and it's my total inefficiency in getting myself unmuted and getting the video going. So I do have a question for you. So do you have any data or understanding on the equity of access to these technologies for those who are subject to coercive treatment? And or are those who are subject to coercive treatment still expected to attend services by and large in person, which is concerning during this period of COVID?
I don't have any research on or research data on that, and I'm not aware of any. I know several people are looking at what occurred during the pandemic, and particularly the lockdown in Victoria, where some mental health tribunals were required to meet in a virtual capacity. I think many of the technologies, at least in the coercive context, are emergent and experimental, at least when it comes to sort of tracking and monitoring. There was a really interesting talk in the UK recently that you can find on YouTube about digital technologies and the application of the Mental Health Act. And I know there are some people doing research on the algorithmic analysis of data that might indicate a person ought to be subject to mental health law. But this is very much in the area of kind of experiment and abstract thinking at the moment, nothing actual. So I would draw people's attention to an excellent article by Kay, our colleague here at the Institute, who wrote a terrific article on mental health in the age of COVID and some of the human rights issues facing people who are before mental health tribunals. So I'd highly recommend that to people. But no, I'm afraid there hasn't been much research in that area, though I'm sure it'll emerge shortly.
Okay, thanks, Piers. I've got another question here for you, which it's Maria O'Sullivan from Monash Law. So her question is about emotion in the law. If we're using apps and tech to diagnose or treat health issues or to make legal decisions relating to health, is it a problem that there is a lack of emotion in these settings? Do we need human aspects such as empathy to make good decisions?
Yeah, it's interesting. In most of the literature and even the kind of marketing materials, but also certainly in the regulatory materials, there is a strong emphasis on the need for these kind of technologies, not to replace face-to-face therapy, but usually to be blended with sort of face-to-face encounters. And you'll see that in the Productivity Commission report, in materials certainly released in the Quality Digital Mental Health Standards, and in a terrific study by Chris Hollis and colleagues in the UK, who gathered a huge number of service users who insisted that this ought to be the case, that face-to-face encounters really ought to be there. But do I think there is a risk that some of the emotion and human encounter can be taken out? I mean, certainly I think there's really challenging ideas there in this idea that a person's interactions with a device can reveal something fundamental about their inner world. You know, every person deserves to be heard and seen as an individual, especially in any kind of encounter that's designed for healing. And so there is certainly a risk that could happen. And I don't think I'd be the first to say so. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. If there's anything I can elaborate on, Miriam can ask again.
Okay. So Simone would like to know, rather than mimicking existing treatments, do you think future mental health technologies will change what type of services are delivered as well as how they are delivered?
I mean, I think that's certainly the case. A colleague of mine, James Horton, described the tendency in technological development to pave the cow paths. So instead of using new technology to do something different based on what that technology can allow to do, there's a tendency with technological development to try to continue the past habits. So I think certainly the most creative examples include people, transforming how this kind of how various kinds of support can happen. I think that's evident in the kind of peer support platforms that I described, and some of the supported decision-making approaches where people can articulate things in their own words and store them in a place that they feel is safe, and the use of information processing for auditing and monitoring processes. So absolutely. And I think that kind of creative use of technology will come from engagement with the art of technological development. There's potentially a lopsided focus on the science and technology, or the science of these kind of technological developments, and potentially limiting our engagement with the art of making technology that's meaningful to people and usable. And I know there are examples from quite outside the mental health system per se for providing support to people who are in distress. I saw an example of a platform that had been developed by train drivers in order to provide support to fellow train drivers who had experienced a situation where someone had stepped onto the tracks, which is for their workforce an occupational hazard. And so that was a very sort of niche area in which a group of people came together to develop something that could provide a platform for mutual aid and support. And so absolutely, I think there are examples for creative uses of technology outside of existing practices.
So maybe if I could just ask a question. We've currently got the Royal Commission into Mental Health. What would you be actually telling them? What do you think are some of the main issues that they need to know?
I could try and summarise my 25-page witness statement, but anyone who's closely interested could go and find that. It's freely available online. But I think my general approach was, well, it's important to kind of get a handle on what exactly exists out there in the current system in terms of digital initiatives that might be in those various categories that I described, and then go into it in a clear-eyed manner, trying to work out how various technologies might support an expansion of the best parts of the system, develop new and creative approaches that could be beneficial, or which are being requested rather by advocates who are service users and families and so on, and just make sure to avoid that technology is being used to extend the worst parts of the system, or drawing resources away from where they're needed most. And I think one of the most important points that I made in that submission is that in neither the peak body representing family members nor the peak body representing service users was there any mention whatsoever of the importance of digital interventions or digital initiatives in fixing problems with the current system. So it's not a priority of those groups, and what was often described, I think, in the consumer peak body was a safe, accessible and non-harmful services. So I suppose if technologies are used toward that end, then fantastic. But technology in and of itself is certainly not a valuable thing. But for more detail, people can again read that statement.
Thank you, Piers. We would like to thank you very much for talking to us today. And Piers actually has a regular newsletter, and I think Claire is going to post the link in the chat box if you'd like to check in with Piers with his newsletter. So thank you very much, and this is we'll say goodbye to everybody now.
Thanks very much, everyone.